Welcome to our deep dive today. It seems like every day we get more and more questions about the Quran.
Mm.
Debates about religious texts always seem to be popping up.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And you guys have sent in some really intriguing videos and articles about the origins of the Quran.
Absolutely.
So I think today we're going to try to dive into those.
Sounds good.
What I think is so interesting about this topic in particular is that it kind of goes beyond just like a theological discussion.
Right.
We're looking at physical manuscript evidence.
Yeah,
We're looking at geography. We're looking at linguistic patterns.
I got it.
So it's really like piecing together a historical puzzle.
It really is. It's fascinating.
Yeah, so where do we even begin with a puzzle like this?
Well, one of the first pieces we have is the top copy manuscript.
Okay.
It's a very early Quran manuscript that's been dated back to the 8th century,
Yeah.
maybe even later.
Okay.
And what makes this manuscript so interesting are the additions and erasures you find within it.
Additions and erasures, what do you mean?
So, for example, in some places, the name Allah appears to have been added by a different hand.
Mm.
Almost like somebody came in and said, oh, we need to add Allah here.
Yeah.
And then in other places, the word Allah was actually erased,
And erased. Why?
potentially because it was repeated too many times.
Oh, so like almost like too many Allahs?
Yeah,
Like it was a mistake.
exactly.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So if the Quran is supposed to be, perfect revelation, why would there be a need for these kinds of changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really raises the issue of how stable the Quranic text was in its very early years.
Right.
Some scholars would suggest that these alterations might point to later attempts to standardize the text.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm.
So we've got this manuscript with some curious changes,
Yes.
but you mentioned geographical research as another piece of this puzzle.
Exactly.
So what's that all about?
So Dan Gibson, he's done extensive research on the geography that's mentioned in the Quran. And his findings actually present a very fascinating challenge to the traditional narrative of Mecca's importance in early Islam.
Okay, so what did he find that challenges that traditional story?
Well, he argues that there is no archaeological evidence that supports the traditional view that Mecca was a major trading center
Right.
during the time the Quran emerged.
Okay.
In fact, his research points to a different location entirely,
Rightly.
hundreds of miles away.
Wow. That's a pretty big difference.
It is.
Is there like a specific example from the Quran that supports this idea of a different location?
Yeah, there's a great example.
Okay.
The Quran mentions olive trees growing in Mecca.
Okay.
Well, olive trees simply can't thrive in Mecca's climate and geography.
Huh. It seems like a small detail.
Yeah, it's a big detail.
But if it's in the Quran, then that's...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this discrepancy raises serious questions about the Quran's origins and the traditional narrative surrounding them.
So if olive trees couldn't grow in Mecca, where could they grow?
Well, his research suggests that the Quranic geography aligns more closely with a region in what is now northwest Saudi Arabia. That area was a thriving trade route during that time period.
Interesting. So it's almost like the pieces of the puzzle are kind of shifting and making a new picture.
It is.
But we've got more pieces to examine.
Yes.
You mentioned linguistic patterns earlier, so what about those?
This is where things get even more interesting. Some scholars would argue that the Arabic language as a written language is relatively new.
Okay.
For example, we don't find any written Arabic texts dating back to the time of Jesus.
So how could the Quran have been revealed in Arabic in the 7th century if Arabic wasn't a written language?
Exactly.
Seems like there's a missing link there.
That's where linguistic analysis comes in. One of the scholars, Dr. Smith, that you sent us, he points out that the Quran actually contains linguistic features that are characteristic of Naboshan Arabic.
Okay.
And that was a dialect that was spoken 600 miles north of Mecca.
Wow. So why would the Quran be written in a dialect so far away from Mecca, if that's where it's supposed to have originated?
Good question.
Yeah. It seems like a big disconnect.
It is.
Are there any other linguistic clues that we should be aware of?
Yes, there's also the influence of Aramaic.
Okay.
And Aramaic was the language of Christian liturgy and scholarship during that time period.
Oh.
And we see Aramaic influence in the Quran's vocabulary.
Okay.
We see it in its grammar,
Right.
and we even see it in some of its theological concepts.
Interesting. So it's almost like suggesting a connection between early Christianity and the development of the Quran.
Yeah. And all of this kind of leads into one of the most interesting pieces of this whole puzzle,
Okay.
which is this concept of qira'at,
Okay.
the different accepted readings of the Quran.
Okay. I've heard of Qira'at, but honestly, I don't really understand what they are or
Right.
why they're even significant.
Well, imagine you have a sentence that's written without any vowels or punctuation. Depending on how you add those in, you can change the meaning of the sentence.
Right.
Qira'at are kind of like that. They're different ways of reciting the Quran,
Okay.
with variations in pronunciation and even word choice.
So it's not just like different accents,
Yeah.
like actual different words.
Different words, which can then lead to different interpretations of the text.
Wow. So these differences, are they like minor or are they like pretty
Well,
significant?
can be very significant.
Really?
Another scholar you sent us, Dr. Keith Small,
Okay.
he's dedicated his career to studying the Quran.
Wow.
He has identified at least 31 different Qurans.
Really Fayan.
He has identified at least 31 different Qurans.
31.
31, with tens of thousands of variations between them.
Okay. That just seems like a lot for a text that's supposed to be the perfect, unchanging word of God.
It does challenge that idea, doesn't it?
It does.
For example, let's look at the two most popular readings, Hafs, which is the standard reading today,
Okay.
and Warsh.
Okay.
There's a verse about feeding the poor during Ramadan.
Right.
Hafs indicates feeding one poor person. Warsh says to feed at least 3.
Oh, wow. So like completely different.
Completely different.
Allocations for how you would actually like live that out.
How you would practice your faith.
Exactly.
So how do Muslims reconcile these variations
Yeah.
with the idea of a single, perfectly preserved Quran?
Well, it's a question that Muslim scholars have grappled with for centuries.
Right.
The traditional response is that all of the readings are divinely inspired
Okay.
and that they just reflect different ways of reciting the Quran.
But if there are so many variations in meaning, then how do you know which one is the right one to follow?
Right.
Yeah.
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
I think the existence of these variant readings just really highlights the complexity of the
Right.
Quran's history and transmission.
Yeah.
It seems like the Quran, like many religious texts, has undergone a process of evolution and development over time.
Okay. So if that traditional narrative of the perfectly preserved Quran is questioned,
Right.
then where do we go from here in trying to understand the Quran's origins? Well, this is where this idea of a prototype Quran comes in.
Okay.
The idea that there may have been an earlier text
Right.
that predates the Arabic Quran we know today.
You mentioned this earlier, and this is where Christoph Luxemburg's research comes in, right?
Yes.
Can you remind me what his work was about and what made it so controversial?
Luxemburg suggests that the Quran might have evolved from Syriac Christian hymns.
Whoa, okay.
And he saw these striking similarities between the language and the themes in these hymns
Okay.
and the Quranic text.
So how did he go about investigating this connection? Like, what kind of evidence was he looking at?
So he focuses on the diacritical marks in the Quran,
Yeah.
those dots and vowels that indicate pronunciation.
Right.
And his theory is that by removing these marks, we can actually see a different layer of the text,
Oh, interesting.
one that reveals these potential Aramaic roots.
So by stripping away those diacritical marks, he's basically going back to like a more raw form of the text.
Exactly.
And when you read the unvocalized Quran in that way,
That's when these certain passages start to sound a lot like these early Christian hymns.
huh,
It's fascinating.
it is. So if his findings are so compelling, why have they been largely ignored or dismissed by mainstream academia?
While not everybody agrees with Luxemburg's methodology,
Okay.
some scholars would argue that removing the diacritical marks is just too speculative, that it's not a legitimate way to analyze the Quran.
Okay.
And others suggest that his interpretations are just too radical
Right.
and challenge these deeply held beliefs about the Quran's divine origins.
So there's resistance from like both within academia and also from the wider Muslim community.
Yes, definitely.
So it seems like every step we take in this deep dive, we just end up with more questions.
We do.
It's almost like we're standing at a crossroads with the traditional narrative on one path
Right.
and these alternative theories like Luxemburg's on another path.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we navigate this? How do we make sense of these different viewpoints?
That's the question, isn't it? I think that's something that each individual will have to grapple with on their own.
Right.
I think the key is to just be open to exploring different possibilities,
Yeah,
examining the evidence carefully, and coming to your own conclusions.
that makes sense. Before we move on, it seems like there's one big piece of the puzzle we haven't fully addressed yet,
Okay.
and that's the standard Islamic narrative.
Yeah.
The story that's been traditionally told about the Quran's compilation.
You're right. We need to examine that traditional account as well.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at how that narrative explains the Quran's origins.
Okay, so we've talked about manuscript evidence and geographical inconsistencies,
Right.
linguistic analysis,
Mm.
even variant readings.
Yes.
Now, let's turn to that traditional Islamic narrative.
Okay.
Can you give us a rundown of that story?
The standard Islamic narrative, as it's often called, really relies on what are known as hadiths.
Hold on a second. Can you just explain what hadiths are
Sure.
for those who might not be
So
familiar?
those who might not be familiar, hadiths are basically collections of sayings and stories that are attributed to the Prophet Muhammad
Okay.
and his companions.
Got it.
They're considered like a crucial source of Islamic law and tradition,
Okay.
second only to the Quran itself.
So what do these hadiths tell us about how the Quran was compiled?
According to the traditional account, the Quran was first compiled shortly after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE.
Okay.
And the story goes that after a battle where many Quran memorizers died,
Right.
there was the sense of urgency
Yeah.
to gather and preserve all those revelations.
That makes sense. If so many people who had memorized portions of the Quran died,
Yes,
it would make sense that you would want to write everything down,
exactly.
just in case.
Preserve it.
Yeah.
So the narrative says that the first caliph, Abu Bakr,
Okay.
he tasked one of Muhammad's scribes,
Okay.
Zayd ibn Thabit,
Okay.
with collecting all the existing fragments of the Quran, whether it was written on palm leaves or stones or preserved in people's memories.
So he was basically the first one to put it all together in one place.
That's what the traditional narrative says.
Okay.
But even within that narrative, there are some interesting details that raise questions.
Okay. Like what?
For instance, Zayd initially hesitated to take on this task.
Really? Why?
He questioned how he could do something
Yeah.
that the Prophet Muhammad himself hadn't done.
It's almost like he's acknowledging that compiling a written Quran was a big departure
Right.
from the original practice of oral transmission.
Exactly.
So if memorization was so reliable, then why was a written version even necessary?
Yeah, it points to this potential tension surrounding the transition
Right.
from an oral to a written tradition.
Yeah.
And then about 20 years later,
Mm.
we have the story of the third Caliph Uthman,
Right.
who ordered a second compilation.
Oh, a second one.
A second one.
Yeah.
And the reason that's given is that different readings of the Quran had emerged, and this was causing disagreements
Of course.
and confusion among
Yeah.
Muslims.
So Uthman wanted to create like a definitive standardized version.
Exactly, to end the confusion.
Okay.
And the story goes that to achieve this standardization, he ordered all the other existing versions of the Quran to be burned.
Well, hold on. Burning other Qurans.
Yeah,
That seems pretty drastic.
it does.
Wouldn't that suggest there was a lot of uncertainty about the text, even back then?
Right,
Like if the Quran was already perfectly preserved,
right.
why would such an extreme measure be necessary?
It's a question that has led some scholars to question the traditional narrative.
Right, because it seems like if there were so many different versions just a few decades after Muhammad's death,
Yeah,
it makes you wonder how it was transmitted
right.
and how it evolved over time.
It really does.
So it's starting to sound like the standard Islamic narrative,
Yeah,
while it's very widely accepted, might have some holes in it.
it might.
Are there any other reasons to kind of question its accuracy?
Well, one of the biggest challenges to this traditional narrative is the lack of contemporary historical evidence.
We simply do not have manuscripts or inscriptions
Yeah.
from the 7th century that support these stories
Right.
of Abu Bakr or Uthman compiling the Quran.
So the earliest accounts we have come from hadith collections
Exactly.
that were compiled much later in the 8th and 9th century.
Right.
So centuries passed before these stories were even written down.
Yes.
That's a long time for oral traditions to be passed down
It is.
and potentially change.
Right.
So it's hard to know how much of that narrative is actually historically accurate.
It's difficult to say for sure.
So while the standard Islamic narrative holds a lot of weight within the Muslim community,
Yeah.
it's important to recognize that it's a narrative that emerged
Right.
and evolved over time.
Absolutely.
It's possible that some elements are based on historical events,
It's possible.
but it's also likely that it's been shaped by various factors,
Mm,
including political agendas and theological interpretations.
for sure.
So how should we approach this narrative then?
That's a good question. Are we saying it's completely false?
Not necessarily. It's more about recognizing that it's a product of its time.
Okay.
And like any historical narrative,
Yeah.
it should be examined with a critical eye.
Right.
And we should consider the possibility that the story of the Quran's origins
Yeah.
is far more complex and nuanced than what has been traditionally presented.
This whole deep dive has just been an exercise in looking beyond the surface
It really
and
has.
questioning what we think we know.
Mm,
We started with what seemed like a pretty straightforward topic,
right.
the origins of the Quran,
Yeah.
but we've uncovered so many layers of history and linguistics
We have.
and theological debate.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. It's been a real eye-opener.
It has. And I think the most important takeaway from all of this is that there's always more to learn.
Hmm.
The search for truth and understanding is an ongoing journey.
Yeah.
It's one that we should embrace with curiosity and open minds.
Well said. So to our listener, we encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating topic.
Yes.
Delve deeper into the sources and arguments that we've discussed.
Please do.
Read the work of scholars like Dr. Smith and Dan Gibson, and even Christoph Luxemburg,
Absolutely.
and form your own conclusions based on the evidence.
Yes. Knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and applied.
Hmm.
So don't shy away from these difficult questions.
Right.
The journey of discovery is yours to take.